Hey, chillers, guess what day it is?
It's Tuesday. I'm Amber,
And I'm Alex.
and this is another episode of True Crime and Chill.
Amber, imagine, okay? Just minding your business, living your life in your little neighborhood, okay? And you sit down with your husband and you watch America's Most Wanted, okay? One of the greatest TV shows ever,
Of all
arguably,
time.
okay?
Yeah.
However, you do notice something a little different about the episode. You notice that a bust of a man, like a clay bust of a man that's been on the run for over 18 years, looks just like the neighbor that used to live down the street. How would you feel about that?
I'd be like, well, that's possible, I suppose.
Well, for one Denver, Colorado resident, that's exactly what happened. But before we dig into that, okay, let's start at the beginning and talk a little about John List.
Let's get to it. Before we start, we would like to use our disclaimer. We're not police, forensic analysis, psychologists, or anything of that matter, other than just two ladies who want to talk about crimes that should be put out there.
If you do have an issue with the cases we discuss, please don't hesitate to nicely reach out to us and talk to us. Otherwise, there are plenty of great podcasts out there that you can listen to instead.
Yeah, so let's get to it.
Okay. So, John Emil List was born September 17th, 1925, in Bay City, Michigan, as the only child of John and Alma List. Now, John lived a pretty normal life growing up in the Lutheran church. His father and his mother were both pretty active in the church. His dad and his mom both taught Sunday school. John participated as well, from what I could find. There really isn't a lot of history leading up to, like, for his childhood, just like the basics and everything. Growing up, John ended up enlisting in the military in 1943. He actually became a laboratory technician for the Army during World War II. So his military career was pretty uneventful from what I could find. He wasn't really an excellent soldier, but he wasn't really a bad soldier. But after 3 years, his contract was finished, so John ended up enrolling at the University of Michigan. He ended up earning a bachelor's degree in business administration and a master's in accounting. So homeboy was working for it back then. In 1950, John was actually recalled back into the Army because of the Korean War. So, because of this, John moved from where he was living at the time to Fort Eustis, Virginia, to finish out his contract. There, he met Helen Taylor, a widow of a vet who had a daughter already. On December 1st, 1951, Helen and John married in Maryland, and then the Army moved both of them to Cali, where they transferred him to Finance Corps because of his degrees and stuff. So they thought that he'd be better fit in that. So the two actually stayed in California until 1952 when he got out of the military because his contract had ended again. And they ended up moving to Detroit after John had gotten a job there.
Okay. Well, I don't know that I would say his military career was uneventful if he had to fight basically in World War II as well as the
So
Korean War, but
I
I
don't
understand what you're
see that
saying.
I couldn't find anything that he was actually deployed. All I saw was that he
Right.
was just enlisted. So
Interesting.
yeah, I couldn't find anything to say that he was actually deployed. If he was, then yes, but if not, like, there really, like I said, there really isn't a lot of information on him um
Hmm.
until everything happens. So, but we'll get to that. We'll get to that. So,
All right.
after working in Detroit for a bit, John actually ended up getting a job in Kalamazoo as a supervisor for a paper company. Not exciting, but hey, it's a job. So, while here, Helen actually ended up giving birth to three more children. So, she had her daughter from the previous marriage, and then now she has three more kids by John. The children were Patricia, John Jr., who John actually said was his favorite and his namesake, and Frederick, the youngest. By 1959, John had become general supervisor of an accounting firm, and it seemed like life was pretty okay. However, in this time, Helen had started to become an alcoholic, and she kind of started spiraling. Or, like, that's what people started saying.
Alcohol is a hell of a thing. I think what's nice about today's society is that being sober is actually more of a commonplace thing.
Yeah.
But back in 1959, 1960, that just wasn't normal. Like people had
Martinis in
mixers and
hand, drinks waiting, like,
Right. And I mean, women who were pregnant were still drinking.
Yeah.
So,
Doctor's like, "Oh, it's fine, just a glass of
but
wine
they
a
were still
day."
smoking too. I mean, there were these things that we didn't realize were really not as good for us. And of course, now our knowledge has increased and we understand scientifically why they're not good for us.
Yeah.
Um, but I mean, it's not totally uncommon to say that there were quite a few alcoholics back in the day, and it can really control so much of your life. A
Well,
lot of
and I
people
mean
don't even realize how much of your life it controls until it's not controlling your life anymore.
well, and also, I mean, being a housewife in the 1950s, like, there really wasn't much to do.
No,
Raise your
no. I
kids
mean, you've
and
seen the
drink.
white wine diet on Facebook, right?
Yes, I have. Oh my god, but we're not gonna get into that because we could talk about that forever. I
Right.
mean, I could follow that diet. In 1960, John ended up moving the family to Rochester, New York for a job at Xerox, the paper company.
Mhm.
So, however, in 1965, so this is 5 years after he accepted that job, he accepted another job at a bank in New Jersey, moving the family to Breeze Knoll, a 19-room mansion located at 431 Hillside Avenue in New Jersey.
Wow.
Yeah, this mansion was huge. Like, there'll be pictures of it on our website, truecrimeandchill.com, but like, when it means 19 rooms, like, I mean, it had this, like, extravagant ballroom, it had, like, a Tiffany skylight, like, a original Tiffany skylight that was worth, like, $10,000 back then. It had, like, this marvelous grand staircase, like, it was a beautiful house, and yeah, so he moves his entire family into this, and he actually ends up moving his mother into the house as well, and she lived in an apartment that was actually located in the attic. So one of the rooms, so like the attic part had actually been like renovated into an apartment essentially. It's like a mother-in-law
Mhm.
suite inside the house.
Nice. I mean, it seems like this guy moved around and acquired jobs frequently, which I've been in that position, so I'm not really in a place to like judge. But when we're talking about 5 moves in almost 10 years, and that's not really a lot of time to make friends or connections, start roots anywhere. So, even more so for Helen, who is stuck at home with the kids all the time, no friends, no social life.
Yeah,
I
like,
mean,
trust me, I know how hard it is to move that much.
mhm,
I moved a lot in my early 20s just because I felt like it, but once I actually, like, had kids and settled down, trying to, like, establish, like, a base camp and people to, like, hang out with and be around and stuff, and I feel like it was a totally different, um, like, atmosphere back
mhm,
then than it is now and stuff,
yep,
and so, you don't really have the support that you need with kids, and I feel that with Helen filling the role of, homemaker and mother that was expected of her back then, it wouldn't really surprise me that she felt lonely with all the moving. But it also makes me wonder why John took so many jobs and kept leaving these jobs because they were obviously good jobs, but he just kept leaving them.
well, he just, it's a number of things. Like he could have not fit in. He could have quit before he was fired. I mean, ultimately, without more information, it's hard to say what the reason really was.
Yeah, and unfortunately, a lot of the information that I tried to dig up didn't really come back to why they were
Well,
quit.
a lot of that stuff wasn't on the computer yet, right? So all of those files, all of that background, all of
I
that
don't even think they
history,
had computers at this point.
not they did, just not the way you would think. Um,
They were like
they
the big giant ones in the
that
room that
filled an
took up
entire
like an
room. Mhm.
entire yeah. So
Basement.
like obviously the records wouldn't be online and stuff like that, which is why it's a little bit harder to try and find information about him.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
okay, so the family is finally living in this beautiful house. Okay. The kids are
Yeah.
established, Helen is established, John is established. Like the kids are going to school, John is working. It seems like everything is normal. Helen and John are both active in their church. John actually taught Sunday school like
Mhm.
his mother and father as well.
Mhm.
Um, the kids are enrolled in sports clubs. They're enrolled. I think it was both John and Patricia, John Jr. and Patricia, who were working at the time. They had this image of like a perfect family
Mhm.
and stuff, and it really did. To everybody, it really did seem like everything was perfect until it wasn't.
Of course.
Um,
That's until it wasn't.
I had to
That's
put
our
that in there.
next.
I wanted to see if you would get that. I
Yeah.
wanted to know if, until it wasn't.
That's what the whoever is thinking about starting a true crime podcast, that is exactly what you should call it, is until it wasn't.
Until it wasn't. So on November 9th, 1971, John gathers 2 of his handguns, loads them, and puts them in his car and takes kids to school. So all 3 kids he takes to school. Helen and Alma ended up staying home as usual. However, when John came home, he took one of the handguns, went into the kitchen where Helen was drinking her coffee, and shot her point blank in the back of the head. So he said that he shot all of his family members in the back of the head because he didn't want them to see it coming. Yeah. So he then goes upstairs to Alma's apartment, gives her a kiss on the head, and then shoots her above the left eye. So, yeah. In one of his interviews, when he said, I gave her a kiss above the head, like Judas, I was kind of like, okay then. So, after shooting his wife and mother, John proceeded to wait for his kids to come home. Okay. Patricia and Frederick were the first. Both of them were shot in the back of the head as they walked through the door. So, as they come through the door, they came through separately. As they come through the door, John's sitting there waiting, shoots them in the back of the head. Just leaves their bodies there. Once he was done, he made himself some lunch because in later interviews he said he was hungry. And he headed out to the post office and the bank where he closed out his mother's account.
The calmness of this is deeply disturbing.
Yeah, in interviews he said like he woke up and decided he was going to do it that day. Like he'd been thinking about it for a bit and he was going to do it that day.
And also the fact that he took his kids to school first. And then after they got home, like, okay, putting aside how incredibly monstrous this whole thing is, right? Like, just if this was normal, which it's clearly not, what
No.
good is that knowledge at school going to do them if they're dead?
And he didn't really like elaborate on that. Like, well, why did you let them go to school? Why didn't you kill them in the middle of the night? But some of his actions later on will possibly explain that, maybe. So, after John closes out his mother's account, which apparently nobody thought was weird at the time because back then he was the man of the house, so this is a time when women really didn't have free reign of their own money. John goes to the high school, okay, where John Jr. is at, watches his soccer game that his son is having, cheers him on, like, yay, go kid, or whatever, like, takes him home. Soon as they got home, John walks his son into the house and shoots him as well. However, the report comes out later that John Jr. Was shot multiple times, which means John basically emptied the clip into his kid. And it shows that because he fought back against his dad. So John Jr. is trying to fight back against his dad because he obviously sees it coming. Because you'll walk in and you see the bodies of your family and you see it coming and you try to fight and stuff. And so John just empties the clip of both guns into his kid. Now this is the one he said that was his favorite and his namesake. And I'm sitting here going, what? So once John had subdued his son, he ended up moving the bodies of his wife and 2 other children into the ballroom and laid them down on an old Boy Scout sleeping bag. So in the ballroom, you have Helen, Patricia, Frederick, and John Jr. all laying on the ground. And I will have crime scene photos on our website, truecrimeandchill.com. They are kind of gruesome, so please view discretion is advised. Do not look at these photos unless you can handle it. He ended up leaving Alma upstairs in her apartment. So she was just up in the attic in her apartment. He then proceeds to clean up all of the blood, all of the mess, make everything look normal. He cuts himself out of every single picture in the house. And I mean every single one. He goes through every photo album, every picture his mother has of him, every picture his wife has in a picture frame, every wedding photo, everything. When the police eventually find the bodies and try to find what he looks like, they can't find any actual pictures of him because all the pictures that have him in it are missing his face. He scratches out his head.
Clever.
So, yeah. So he does that. And he also ends up writing a 5-page letter that he leaves on his desk to his pastor on why he decided to kill his family.
What did he say was the reason?
So in the letter, and this is what was said in the letter. This isn't what is said in later interviews. But in the letter, he said he apparently saw that the world was an evil and sick place, that his family was starting to go down a path of darkness, so he killed them. So he would see their souls in heaven when he died. But he didn't kill himself because that means he would go to hell automatically.
Yeah, there's also that
Thou shalt not
commandment.
kill.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know. When I was reading this, I was like, how does that make any sense? But again, we are not psychopaths, and that's what he is. And the thing is he ends up just coldly calculating all of, like, he was cold and calculated and he knew what he was doing. Like, it's not like he just killed his family and fled. Like, he killed his family. He made a sandwich in the kitchen. He cleaned up his messes. He cut out his face in every single picture. He cleared out his mother's bank account, which is why he had the money to
Go start a
eventually
new life.
disappear and stuff, because he disappears for 18 years. So, like, I'm sitting here going, you want to see them, but you don't want to kill yourself because that means you're going to hell. Buddy, if hell is a place, you're already going there.
Yeah.
Like, you're already going there.
Yeah, a little late for that, sir.
Like, so, but he leaves this as a confession to his pastor. So just kind of keep that in mind for a little bit later in the thing. So, confession to his pastor.
All right.
So it takes almost a month, okay? A full month for the murders to be discovered, okay? Because he was calculated in this. Mainly it was because the family wasn't all that social in the first place outside of church. But John was calculated in this, okay? He sent letters to the kids' schools, I think after he had picked them up saying, hey, and their jobs, and the kids' jobs, saying, hey, we're visiting Helen's sick mother in North Carolina for a few weeks. We don't know when we're going to be back. It's probably going to be probably about a month. So the kids need to be excused from these things while we're gone. He tells his church the same thing. Like, he tells basically everybody in their lives that would raise an alarm. So, like, the schools, the church, the work, stuff like that. Her mom, so Helen's mom was actually supposed to come visit them the month that he did all this. Okay. However, she ended up canceling because she was sick. And so John later says that in an interview after he was caught, if Helen's mother had come down, she would have been his sixth victim.
That's horrifically honest.
Right? Like, could you imagine, like, your son-in-law, honestly, I don't even know if Helen's mother was still alive by the time he was caught. But, like, could you imagine, like, if you were alive, you hear, like, your son-in-law be like, oh, yeah, by the way, if you had come and visited us like you had planned to, you'd be dead, too. Like, what?
It just shows that he had a plan in his brain and it didn't matter who was really there. It didn't matter if it was his kids and his wife or his mother-in-law or his mother. They just were all going to die.
Well, and the thing is like, when I first started reading about this case was actually told to me by a friend, like, I think 2 years ago. But when I first started reading about this case, I was like, God, why, like, what is going on? But then when he gets caught, he explains it, and it's definitely nothing like he explained in the letter. So again, we'll get to that.
Yeah.
So, like I said, this guy planned everything down to the tiniest detail, okay? He stopped all mail deliveries, he stopped milk deliveries, he stopped newspaper deliveries, so that way nobody would notice an abundance of them being on the porch. He ended up leaving all the lights on in the house as well. So every single light in the house was on. The fact that he had the foresight, like I said, to cut himself out of all the pictures in the house so it was harder to identify him shows that this wasn't just something he woke up and decided to do. He had planned to do this. He just needed a day.
Yeah. I just um, if all the lights were on in the house, why did the neighbors not say anything before?
So, like I said before, they weren't really all that social with their neighbors. Like, yeah, if they saw each other outside, oh, hey, John, oh, hey, Bob, like, what's up? Like, how are the kids and stuff? Like, that was basically the extent of the interaction that the lists had with their neighbors and stuff. They
Mhm.
didn't really have the dinners and the parties and the soirees and stuff. And even though they lived in this fabulous mansion and they had all this money, they kept to themselves. They were kind of recluses. So they really didn't think like anything was out of the ordinary because they thought, oh, okay, maybe we just haven't noticed that they were coming and going, because Alma probably stayed at the house constantly. And
Yeah,
so did Helen
probably.
and stuff. And so they probably just didn't think anything of it. But once the lights started burning out, that's when the neighbors were like, wait a minute. Because the lights started burning out. Like, first it was a porch light, and then it was a few lights inside the windows. And people were like, why isn't anybody fixing these? Half the house is dark, half the house is light. And finally, they're like, maybe we should call the police and get a welfare check. So they end up calling the police. So on December 7th, almost a full month after the murders have been committed, police used, it was like basically an unlocked door down in the basement, and they were able to walk up into the house, and that's where they discovered the bodies of the List family, sans John, dead in the house. Once they realized that everybody was there but him, the search for John List was on. So they probably thought at first, like, something horrific happened to his family and, like, they took him, which it was probably the thing. But at the same time, I think once they started searching the house, they probably realized, oh,
They
no, this
probably found
dude
the
is in
letter and also saw that he had
Yeah,
removed
once
himself
they
from all
saw
the
the letter and the
photos.
pictures, they probably were like, oh, never mind. But, like, my thing is like, what? like, like, he woke up one day and was like, I'm gonna kill my family. And, like, we have done stories on family annihilators before. And John, at first, he really seemed like he fell into the religious aspect for family annihilators, where, we did the story on Chris Watts, where he fell more into the aspect of he didn't want the burden of having a family anymore. So with John List, it was more, the religious aspect, or so it seemed at first.
Yeah, I mean, that's what the letter would indicate.
Yeah, so that's why I say, so it seemed at first. Like, later on, we're gonna find that there was a kind of like a deeper thing. It's still it's still like, it's like half and half. Like, it's still half religious reason, half another reason, which we'll get to here soon. But it's just, it just blows my mind. He literally just woke up and was like, yeah, I'm gonna do this. Let's do this. Like, and to go to your kid's soccer game and, like, cheer him on and be like, yeah, go John and stuff, and, like,
You're gonna die.
take him home, and him have absolutely no clue. Like, it baffles me. It does. It baffles me.
Well, we're not psychopaths. I mean, we're a
No,
little
we're not.
crazy, obviously, but we're not psychopaths.
No, we are not. We are not. So once the police were in the house and investigation started, things blew up. Like, this was the biggest crime that happened in New Jersey since the kidnapping of the Lindenberg baby in, like, 1932. This is the biggest crime in New Jersey since the kidnapping of the Lindbergh baby in 1932. And if you don't know who the Lindbergh baby is, basically he was a kid. His name was Charles Lindbergh Jr. He was 20 months old. He was the son of famous aviator Charles Lindbergh Sr. and Ann Morrow Lindbergh. And this kid was just taken from his crib in the middle of the night one night, and, like, it blew up. And there was this huge search for him. There was a note basically saying, hey, have $50,000 ready, like, we'll return your kid in one piece. And they did. Long story short, the baby did not get returned in one piece, and it's a very, very sad story. So it's a very, very sad story. So yeah, so basically this is the biggest case that New Jersey had seen since that case.
That's a
And
big deal.
yeah, it was a huge deal, because
Yeah.
it's like, they had like occasional murder here and, like, maybe a robbery or something.
Well,
They had like a
it's New
murder.
Jersey, right?
Yeah, they had like a murder here, case of arson, like, stuff like that. But this was 5 bodies in a house for a month.
Yeah,
Like, this was
I can't.
huge.
Is it bad that my first thought is, oh my God, how'd the neighbors not smell it?
I thought that too, but I mean, looking at the neighborhood, the houses are pretty, like, they're distantly sized, and it's a huge house. I think that you would have to be, like, literally, like, on top of the house or sharing a wall for you to smell it. But again, I don't know. I don't know. They ended up putting out a description of, like, the family car and a description of John to the best of their abilities, and canvassing all known airports and train stations, because that's obviously where you would go if you were trying to run from the law. So they ended up finding the
Yeah.
car parked at JFK Airport in New York. There was no proof that John had actually boarded a flight.
Mm-hmm.
And with no good pictures of him, because he destroyed all of them, they didn't really have a lot to go on except for pictures that somebody may have taken and drawings from friends and drawings like for sketches from friends and coworkers in the area. And again, this is back in the this is like back in like what, the 70s? Did I say the 70s?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and
Yeah.
everything was very, very different then. The same kind of ID verification wasn't needed to fly. I mean, there's a lot of security stuff that wasn't in place yet that really
They
would
had
have made it possible
syphilis
for him to just
checks before you
disappear.
got married. They had syphilis checks before you got married in certain states. That's how like completely different world. Completely, and it's not like we had smartphones back then. Like, geez, John, like, no. So the police put out the sketches of John, tried to get the word out, but without actual photos of him and no leads on actually where he went, they were kind of at a standstill. Ironically, 9 months after the murders, the house still sat empty and vacant for a good reason, and it was actually burned down due to arson.
Really?
Yeah, like
Hmm.
they discovered that somebody had actually burnt it down. It wasn't an electrical issue, like somebody had gone and started a fire and burned it down. But they couldn't
Shocker.
find out who it was. There was a word put out, like I honestly
I
think it
mean,
was just
so
somebody.
yeah, I mean, it could have been John. Like he could have
It
circled
wasn't
back
John.
around and just
It wasn't
burned it
John.
down.
It wasn't John. He already in the timeline that is backed up by
Yeah,
actual records of like where he was at the time. He was not back in.
yeah.
So what they think is somebody in the neighborhood or somebody in the town came around and just burned the house down because they were tired of seeing it.
Yeah, the bad memories based on the fact that they didn't know where he was, and it putting my brain in that place. It could be him. It's
Yeah,
clearly not because there's proof that it's not. But you know, but I mean, on the other hand, you have the neighborhood, right? And with the neighborhood, you're going to have people that are like, that house is an eyesore. Somebody just needs to take care of it, and at the same time, you also had kids that would run around and do dumb things and they weren't policed by their parents. So
yeah.
there's any
And
number
I
of
mean, it
things
was
that
a
honestly
gorgeous
could have been.
house. It just sat empty and vacant. And thank God it was empty and vacant when it burned to the ground. Otherwise, so 18 years go by before
All
the
that evidence,
FBI. Hmm.
all that evidence.
Oh, well, they had all the evidence out, but like, I mean, like if a new family had been living there,
Right,
because that would be
right.
bad.
But also, if they hadn't found the family yet and then they burned it down.
Oh yeah, that too. That too. So 18 years go by before the FBI and the local
Yeah.
police would have any clue about what happened to John. In May of 1989, Fox was actually in the middle of its new show, America's Most Wanted. It was the first season, like it was doing really well. It was a show that was actually hosted by John Walsh at the time, who unfortunately has had his own fair share of trauma with unsolved cases. And it brought a different case to light every week that they thought the public could help solve. So these like were all unsolved cases.
Yeah.
So either they knew. So for those of you who may be babies, and I say that in a very respectful and loving way because some of you guys don't know who Spice Girls are. America's Most Wanted was basically a TV show where they'd pick cases and it would be like, hey, this person's on the run. We know who it is. We have sketches of this person. Can you help us identify this person? And if you knew who it was, then you called the hotline at the end of the show, and it would just go from there. And it actually helped close a lot of open cases. And it ran, I think, up until 2018. I think it ran for a long time. It ran for
Yeah.
a really long time,
Unsolved
and they're trying.
Mysteries with Robert Stack did a similar,
Yeah,
had a similar track
Unsolved
record.
Mysteries, America's Most Wanted, like all of those, like 48
Mhm.
Hours, like yes, all of those. So during the first season, the murder of the List family in New Jersey was one of the focus of the show. Was a focus of one of the shows.
Yeah.
Because they had no actual photos of John List, they ended up hiring a forensic sculptor who was actually who he was well renowned in the field, to make a clay bust of John that they were able to show the public to see if anybody could identify him. So this is a clay bust of John that they have, okay? And this is a picture of John List, and this is with his family. And again, all of these will be on our website, truecrimeandchill.com, as well, so you can look at him. And that's a picture of John and his family. Look how scarily accurate that is. Right? Right? And he had like no
Oh, that's
pictures to
good.
go on.
That
He
guy's
lit this.
good at what he does.
Oh yeah, no, he was one of the most sought after like forensic guys to do this. Like, and this is a job. Like, I follow 3 or 4 people on TikTok who do this as a job and everything. Like, they'll take skulls and they'll recreate
Mhm.
faces for unsolved cases and stuff, and Jane and John Doe's. And this guy was like, literally, he was like, if you watch Grey's Anatomy, he was the Derek Shepherd of his field. Okay, like that's what this guy was, and all he had to go on was sketches and like what people would tell them, like, oh, he had like a mole right here and everything. And so when I first heard about this case, they're like, "Oh yeah, he was busted from from a clay bust." I was like, "There's no way." And then I looked up the clay bust picture, and I was like, "Oh my god, like it's almost identical." So they ended up getting this guy to do this, okay, and they had it showing all throughout the America's Most Wanted episode and stuff, and so they knew it was a
Mhm.
long shot that somebody could identify him because maybe the person who could wasn't watching the show. Like it was always a long shot, but they had to try. This case had gone unsolved for 18 years. And in a home in Denver, Colorado, in a tiny little neighborhood, somebody looks at this clay bust and goes, I know that man. However, by the time they called the tip in, they said they when they called the tip in, okay, they said, the man that I'm thinking of, like, he doesn't go by the name John List. He goes by the name Robert Peter Clark, or Bob to his friends and colleagues. So the police were like, okay, we're gonna look into this. Can you like give us a little? Can you come into the police station so you can give us a description of him and stuff? So the neighbor does, and on June 1st, 2 weeks after the show aired, Robert Clark was arrested as John List. Now again, Robert Clark was living in Virginia at this time. He maintained his innocence despite all the similarities. Oh, I'm not John List. My name is Robert Clark. My name is Robert Peter Clark. My name is Robert Peter Clark. Like the entire time. And this went on for months. Like they got his fingerprints and all this other stuff, but like
Wouldn't
again,
you?
right, right, yeah, true. But like they got his fingerprints and stuff. And so unlike now where you can run fingerprints, there's a national database and everything, like it pops up. You got to do these by hand back then. It takes forever. So they take his fingerprints and they end up extraditing him back to New Jersey from Virginia for his crimes. And they sent his fingerprints in to the military so that way they can try to identify his military records through his fingerprints, because they're like, if this is John List, he's going to have a military record. So, however, the charade came to an end for Robert Clark when the fingerprints match the military records. Like you cannot lie on that. So John drops the act and admits, yeah, no, yeah, I'm John List. And so in February of 1990, they finally have their guy.
I mean, just this guy murders his family in cold blood, vanishes, and just lives a different life across the country for 18 years. And that's what most I think most people who try to get away with crimes like this, that's the dream.
Oh yeah, no, I mean, you look at a lot of the crimes who are like, oh, I tried to escape it and everything, but it's like this guy literally did for 18 years. Literally did for 18 years. If America's Most Wanted didn't pick up this episode, like, and what's even crazier is he watched the end of this episode with his wife. Yeah, he remarried. He watched the end of this episode with his new wife. And he says in an interview, he's sitting there sweating to death. Like just sweating to death, not moving a muscle as they watch the end of this episode. And his wife has like no clue. Like she's just watching this episode. She just doesn't like. He said that his wife had absolutely no clue. And I can't find anything on her to like back that up. But like, could you imagine? Like you're just sitting there watching TV, catching the end of the show with your husband. All of a sudden, the guy on the TV who killed his former family looks like your husband. Like, what? So she had a kid too. She had children already. So once they actually had John in custody, he begins to basically
He
tell
has
him,
a type.
yeah, right. But he basically, oh, it gets better. So he basically begins to tell him everything, everything that he had been up to after killing after killing his family all those years before. So the night he left town, he ended up taking his car to the airport and left it there. From there, he got a bus from New York to Denver, Colorado, where he assumed the alias of Robert Peter Clark, the name of a former classmate. Now, the real Robert Clark is like, I've never known this guy before. So he probably is just somebody that John saw or did go to school with, but like never really associated with. So he ended up working as a fry cook in Denver until he was able to get a job as an accountant. In 1972, he acquired a different job, and so from 1972 to 1986, he basically establishes his life. He becomes a member of the Lutheran Church in the community. He starts running a carpool for church members who may not be able to make it on their own. He ends up meeting Dolores Miller. She was a clerk who worked at a PX on post for the army base there. And they got married in 1985. In 1988, the couple actually moved to Virginia, where John got another job, still under the alias of Robert Clark, and started working. So, however, the next year after they moved to Virginia, the episode about his family's murdered aired. Even though he and his wife caught the tail end, she had absolutely no clue that it was him. And nobody in his new neighborhood knew that it was him. It was only because a neighbor from his old Denver, Colorado area recognized him and called the police that John was caught. Like, he almost got away with this.
Almost.
Almost. It was almost got. I bet you it was a white woman watching America's Most Wanted that did this. I bet you dollars to donuts. I bet you it was a white
I don't
woman.
know. I mean, it's Denver, so probably.
I bet you it was a white woman who used to talk to her husband all the time about that Robert Clark guy that seemed just a little off. But her husband was always like, no, babe, it's fine. It's okay. He's really chill. He knows how to grill a burger. Just because you know how to grill a burger does not mean you're a good guy. Like, I bet you. And like like I said, I can't find anything on the neighbor because it's all anonymous and everything, which is understandable. But so it started coming out that there was more to the story than John didn't say in the letter when he first killed his family. Of course. Because why wouldn't there be more to the story? So the real thing is John had been laid off with the bank that he'd been working at. It wasn't his fault. They were just budget cuts. He was laid off. So instead of going to work every morning, he basically just got up, went to the train station, read a newspaper, went and took a nap in his car, ate lunch, screwed around, sometimes looked for a new job. Like, he basically just kept going and going and going until he didn't have anything left to go for. And he didn't have any money. He wasn't getting a paycheck. None of the bills were getting paid. Everything was getting paid sparsely with his mom's bank account money. Like, just enough to where he could cover, like, the top part of the bills, but not enough to where she would notice there was stuff missing. So he was so ashamed that he wasn't able to take care of his family, and instead of, talking to them about it, he just ignores the issue. Like, he just ignores the issue. He also said that Helen was getting worse, not because of her alcoholism, but because of the case of syphilis she had contracted from a previous marriage that he didn't know about until after they had gotten married. He actually tried to say in court that, like, she tricked him into getting married in a different state because that state didn't do syphilis tests. I didn't know that was a thing before marriage until I did this case. In some states, they made you take a syphilis test before you got married. Yeah.
Right, I knew that.
I didn't know that. I didn't realize it was that big of an issue.
Yeah. Yeah, it was.
Like, how bad does a syphilis outbreak have to be for a state to rule that you have to take a test before you get married? But then he also tried to be like,
Ones
oh,
with major populations had to do that. Yeah.
I'm just like, what? But then he tried to be like, oh, well, she tricked me into getting married also because
How
she said
bad
that
does
she
a
was pregnant.
pandemic have to be before the government steps in and shuts down all the businesses?
Yeah, it's
I
true.
mean,
But he also
and
tried
this
to
was
be like,
also a more religious time when you often didn't have sex until you were married. Often, not always.
no, to say, nah. So, but he also tried to say that, like, oh, she said she was pregnant, but she wasn't really, and I didn't find out till after we were married and stuff. So,
Yeah.
yeah. He basically made it seem like she was turning into this like wild, like crazed, like paranoid hermit and everything. And that's why they were so secluded from society, and that's why they didn't interact with people, is because she publicly and privately shamed him and like shamed his sex life and why he wasn't comparable to her first husband, all this other stuff or whatever. And he tried to be like that's the real reason why his mother moved in, not because his dad died, but because his like he needed help with the kids, and so that way she could help with Helen and her issues and all this other stuff. And it was just this huge thing. It was just this huge thing. So
He may have
during
believed
the
it.
trial,
I mean, you hit a point where, you tell yourself something long enough, you start to believe it.
oh,
Doesn't
and he
mean it's
probably
true,
did.
but
He probably did believe it. And later on in different interviews that I'll link on our website, like he says them in the interviews where it's like, wow, he actually does believe this stuff. So during the trial, a psychiatrist actually said that John suffered from OCD and only saw two options out of the dilemma he was in: accept welfare or kill his family. He chose the latter simply because welfare was too embarrassing for him and would subject his family to ridicule.
Mhm. Yeah, that makes a whole lot of sense.
Right? Like, screw help. Like, let's just end the situation right now. Like, this case is just mind-boggling, and like it, and there's so much more that we haven't covered in this just because it's like we don't have the time for it. So on April 12th, 1990, okay, and this is years after, John was finally convicted of 5 counts of first-degree murder of his family. Though
Right.
John tried to say he wasn't responsible for the murders, the judge saw right through that. He tried to argue that it was due to PTSD from his military days, and that the letter he left behind for his pastor was a confession that shouldn't be admissible in court.
Doesn't work that way, sir.
Nope. Nope. The only way that's ever true is if I believe, hold on, copy that. So if you admit it to a psychiatrist or a counselor, they cannot use it in court.
Mhm.
Actually, I think that's how it works.
Depending on the situation.
If you
It
admit,
depends. It depends on the situation because it's not always true.
under Roman
A
Catholic law, it's
priest,
forbidden
yeah,
for a priest to disclose information under any circumstances obtained from the religious confession. So yeah, so he tried to say
sure.
that
Roman
he tried
Catholics,
yeah, so he
not
tried to say that
Lutherans.
the letter was a confession to his pastor and shouldn't be admissible in court. But what he didn't realize is that he was a Lutheran. He wasn't a Roman Catholic, and that's only applicable to Roman Catholics.
That is why there's a separation of church and state.
Yeah, and unfortunately, if a Roman Catholic priest does testify at any kind of trial like this, he is excommunicated from the church. So, eventually, John expressed his version of guilt, saying, quote, "I wish I never done what I did. I regret my actions and pray for forgiveness every night since," unquote.
Because
When
you
asked
got
why he
caught, jerk.
when asked why he didn't just kill himself, he said that suicide was a sin and he wanted to be reunited with his family. Again, like I said before, murdering is a sin as well, dude. So I don't think you're going to the same place. I really don't. John eventually died from complications from pneumonia at the age of 82 in March of 2008. The newspaper in Westfield, New Jersey, that reported his death reported it as the boogeyman of Westfield was finally dead.
Thank you for listening to True Crime and Chill. For more information, including case notes, photos, and sources, visit our website at truecrimeandchill.com. You can also stay connected with us on social media. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. Look for new episodes from us each week on Tuesdays.